The Han Dynasty did not fall with a single blow. It disintegrated across 60 years of administrative corrosion, warlord ambition, and the slow starvation of imperial authority. By 220 CE, when the last Han emperor abdicated, China had already become a landscape of competing military economies. Three emerging powers Wei in the north, Shu Han in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast each claimed the mandate of heaven. What followed was not merely civil war, it was a continental-scale experiment in strategic exhaustion. The Three Kingdoms period represents one of history's most lethal conflicts by proportion. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 36 million. Other assessments reach 40 million. Whether through direct combat, famine induced by scorched-earth campaigns, or epidemic disease accelerated by mass displacement, the population of China contracted by approximately 60%. The Yellow River Basin, once the demographic heartland of the empire, became a depopulated corridor of burned villages and abandoned irrigation networks. This was not a war of ideological fervor, it was a war of inherited fragmentation. The collapse of the Han had created a power vacuum that no single faction possessed the resources to fill. Each kingdom understood that reunification under a rival would mean annihilation. Thus, the conflict became existential by default. Victory meant survival. Defeat meant erasure from the historical record. The geographic distribution of power was deceptive. Wei, under the Cao family, controlled the largest territory and population. Its northern plains provided grain reserves and cavalry breeding grounds. Yet Wei faced a two-front dilemma. To the southwest, Shu Han leveraged natural mountain barriers to create a defensible position that absorbed Wei offensives like a strategic sponge. To the southeast, Wu exploited riverine superiority and naval logistics to deny Wei access to the Yangtze economic corridor. Shu Han, founded by Liu Bei and strategically guided by the Chancellor Zhuge Liang, was the smallest of the three kingdoms. It possessed perhaps one-tenth of Wei's population. Yet Sichuan's geography transformed this disadvantage into strategic depth. The basin was accessible only through narrow mountain passes, natural choke points that allowed Shu forces to defend against numerically superior Wei armies. Zhuge Liang's northern campaigns, though ultimately unsuccessful, forced Wei to maintain permanent garrisons along the frontier. This was not conquest. It was strategic bleeding. Wu, under the Sun family, controlled the richest agricultural lands and the most developed naval infrastructure. The Yangtze River functioned as both a defensive barrier and a logistical highway. Wu's shipyards could produce vessels faster than Wei could train crews to counter them. Yet Wu's strategic ambition was constrained by terrain. The mountains separating Wu from Shu Han were impassable for large-scale military operations. Wu's northern frontier with Wei, however, was a fluid zone of amphibious raids and riverine skirmishes. The Three Kingdoms War was a conflict of logistical attrition. Armies moved not by rail or motorized transport, but by foot and riverboat. A northern campaign from Wei into Shu territory required the pre-positioning of grain stockpiles 6 months in advance. A Wu naval raid up the Yangtze demanded coordination between shipyards, granaries, and forward supply depots. The battlefield was secondary to the supply line. Commanders understood that the army which could sustain itself in hostile territory held the initiative. This was not a war of pitched battles alone. It was a war of fortified cities, river crossings, and siege engines. It was a war where a single flooded plain could halt an offensive for an entire campaign season, where a well-timed fire ship could destroy a supply convoy and unravel months of preparation. The Three Kingdoms period elevated logistics to the status of an art form. The human cost of this conflict cannot be abstracted into strategy alone. The collapse of centralized authority meant the collapse of public infrastructure. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair, famine became cyclical. Warlords requisitioned grain at sword point, leaving peasant communities with insufficient reserves for the next planting season. Disease followed displacement. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery spread through refugee columns and besieged cities. The Three Kingdoms War was fought on the bodies of the Chinese peasantry. Armies conscripted farmers during planting season, ensuring harvest failures. Scorched-earth tactics employed by all three kingdoms deliberately destroyed. agricultural capacity to deny resources to advancing enemies. The Shu Han general Jiang Wei, during his northern campaigns, burned granaries and salted fields to prevent Wei forces from living off the land. Wei's response was identical. The result was mutual impoverishment. Yet this war was also a forge of military innovation. The introduction of the repeating crossbow attributed to Zhuge Liang provided Shu forces with a rate of fire advantage against Wei's superior numbers. Wu's development of trebuchet-armed warships allowed for standoff bombardment of coastal fortifications. Wei's cavalry reforms, incorporating stirrups and composite bows, created mobile shock units capable of disrupting enemy formations before infantry contact. The war's strategic character was defined by stalemate. Between 220 and 263 CE, the borders shifted incrementally. Wei launched 5 major offensives into Shu territory. All were repelled. Zhuge Liang launched 5 northern campaigns into Wei territory. All failed to achieve their objectives. Wu and Wei fought the Battle of Hefei multiple times over 4 decades, with control of the city changing hands repeatedly. This was not a war of Napoleonic decisiveness. It was a war of Verdun-like attrition, stretched across continents and generations. The strategic objective reunification of China under a single dynasty remained theoretically achievable. Yet the practical requirements to achieve it exceeded the capacity of any single kingdom. Wei possessed the manpower but lacked the logistical reach to conquer both Shu and Wu simultaneously. Shu possessed defensible terrain but lacked the population to sustain prolonged offensives. Wu possessed economic resources but lacked the land routes necessary to project power into the interior. The result was a 60-year equilibrium of exhaustion. Each kingdom bled itself in campaigns that produced tactical victories but strategic stalemates. The war consumed 3 generations of military leadership. It became a self-perpetuating system, where the act of preparing for war became indistinguishable from the act of waging it. The 3 Kingdoms' War did not occur in isolation. The Silk Road continued to function, though trade volumes declined sharply. Wei's control of the northern plains meant control of overland routes to Central Asia. Control of southern ports meant access to maritime trade with Southeast Asia. Shu Han, isolated in its mountain basin, was the most economically constrained. Yet this isolation forced innovation. Shu Han developed advanced metallurgical techniques to compensate for limited trade access. Its blacksmiths produced high-quality steel for weapons and armor. Its engineers constructed wooden ox automata mechanical supply carts to transport grain through mountainous terrain. Necessity drove technological adaptation. Wei's strategic position was paradoxically both advantageous and precarious. Its large population provided manpower reserves but also created administrative complexity. Maintaining loyalty among regional warlords required constant political maneuvering. The Cao family's legitimacy rested on military success. Prolonged stalemate eroded that legitimacy. By 249 CE, internal power struggles within Wei created opportunities for rivals. The Sima family, originally military commanders, gradually usurped control of the Wei state apparatus. Wu faced a different challenge. Its economic prosperity depended on maritime trade and Yangtze River commerce. Any disruption to naval superiority threatened the kingdom's fiscal base. Wu invested heavily in shipbuilding and crew training. Its admirals developed tactics for fighting on rivers and in coastal waters. The Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 CE, decisive, Wu victory over Cao numerically superior forces demonstrated the effectiveness of these innovations. The war reshaped China's economic geography. Northern trade routes atrophied as Wei and Shu fought over mountain passes. Southern maritime routes became more important. Wu's ports at Jian and Jiaozhou saw increased traffic. The economic center of gravity shifted southward, a trend that would define Chinese history for centuries. Yet the war also destroyed economic capacity. The population decline meant labor shortages, fields lay fallow, urban centers shrank. The sophisticated bureaucratic infrastructure of the Han Dynasty tax collection, granary management, road maintenance collapsed in many regions. Warlords improvised local systems of governance, creating a patchwork of administrative competence. The strategic question was not whether reunification would occur, but which kingdom could outlast the others. Wei's advantage in population and territory was offset by its two-front exposure. Shu Han's defensible position was offset by its demographic limitations. Wu's economic resources were offset by its geographic isolation from the northern plains. The war became a contest of endurance, where the victor would be the kingdom that collapsed last. Wei's military doctrine was built on the legacy of Cao Cao's reforms. Cao Cao had recognized that the collapse of the Han Dynasty required a new model of military organization. He implemented a system of military agriculture colonies Tunshan, where soldiers farmed land during peacetime and mobilized for campaigns during wartime. This system reduced logistical dependence on civilian populations and created a self-sustaining military economy. Wei's standing army numbered approximately 400,000 at its peak. This force was divided into provincial garrisons, mobile field armies, and specialized units. The provincial garrisons defended fixed positions and maintained local order. The field armies were the offensive instrument capable of rapid deployment to threatened sectors. Specialized units included cavalry archers, siege engineers, and river flotillas. Wei's cavalry was its strategic advantage. The northern plains provided grazing land for horses and allowed for large-scale cavalry operations. Wei's cavalry units combined speed and firepower. They were equipped with composite bows, capable of engaging enemies at range, before closing for melee combat with sabers and lances. The introduction of stirrups, likely adopted from Central Asian steppe peoples, increased rider stability and effectiveness. Wei's infantry was organized into heavy and light divisions. Heavy infantry wore lamellar armor overlapping iron plates laced together and carried long pikes or halberds. They formed the defensive core of Wei armies, capable of holding ground against enemy charges. Light infantry carried crossbows and short swords. They provided ranged support and pursued broken enemy formations. Wei's siege capabilities were among the most advanced of the era. Siege engineers constructed trebuchets counterweight catapults, capable of hurling stones weighing over 100 kilograms. These weapons could breach wooden palisades and damage stone fortifications. Wei also employed siege towers, mobile structures that allowed attackers to reach the top of enemy walls. Undermining digging tunnels beneath walls to cause collapse was a standard technique. Yet Wei's greatest asset was logistical sophistication. The Tunshan system provided grain reserves near frontier zones. Wei's engineers constructed granaries with elevated floors to prevent rot and pest infestation. Supply convoys were organized with military precision guards, scouts, and reserve carts in case of breakdown. Wei could sustain field armies of 50,000 for campaigns lasting 6 months. Shu Han's military structure was designed for asymmetric defense. With a population 1/10 that of Wei, Shu could not win through attrition. Zhuge Liang's strategy was to leverage terrain, technology, and strategic exhaustion. Shu's armies were smaller but more mobile. They were trained to fight in mountainous terrain where Wei's cavalry advantages were neutralized. Shu Han's infantry was its core strength. Soldiers were equipped with crossbows, often the repeating crossbow, which could fire multiple bolts before reloading. This weapon provided a higher rate of fire than the single-shot crossbows used by Wei and Wu. In narrow mountain passes, where large formations were impossible, the repeating crossbow allowed Shu defenders to create concentrated fields of fire. Shu Han's engineering corps was exceptional. Zhuge Liang personally designed fortifications, supply carts, and even mechanical devices for transporting grain. The wooden ox and gliding horse semi-mythical automated supply carts may have been human-powered wheelbarrows with advanced gearing mechanisms. Whether fully automated or merely ingeniously designed, these devices reduced the logistical burden on Shu's limited manpower. Shu Han's northern campaigns were offensive operations designed to achieve strategic defense. Zhuge Liang understood that waiting passively for Wei attacks would allow Wei to choose the time and place of engagement. By launching preemptive offensives into Wei territory, Zhuge forced Wei to defend its own frontier and diverted Wei resources away from preparations for invasions of Shu. These campaigns were not intended to conquer Wei. That was beyond Shu's capacity. Instead, they aimed to weaken Wei through attrition. capture strategic positions, and inspire defections among Wei's population. Zhuge Liang's psychological warfare included distributing proclamations calling for the restoration of the Han Dynasty. He positioned Shu Han as the legitimate heir to Han imperial authority. Shu Han's military doctrine emphasized discipline and training. Zhuge Liang implemented strict codes of conduct. Officers who failed in their duties faced execution. Soldiers who deserted faced capital punishment. Yet Zhuge also ensured his troops were well supplied and fairly treated. This combination of discipline and care created a cohesive fighting force. Shu's strategic weakness was demographic. Every soldier lost was irreplaceable. After Zhuge Liang's death in 234 CE, Shu Han struggled to maintain offensive operations. His successors, notably Jiang Wei, continued northern campaigns but with diminishing returns. Wei adapted to Shu's tactics, fortifying mountain passes and creating layered defenses. By 263 CE, Shu Han's military capacity had eroded to the point where Wei's final invasion succeeded. Wu's military power rested on its navy. The Yangtze River was Wu's strategic moat. Wei possessed the manpower to invade Wu by land, but the Yangtze crossings were narrow and defensible. Wu's warships patrolled the river, intercepting Wei supply convoys and landing parties. Wu's admirals developed tactics for fighting on water ramming, boarding, and fire attacks. Wu's warships ranged from small patrol boats to large multi-deck vessels. The largest ships, called tower ships, were floating fortresses. They carried trebuchets, allowing them to bombard enemy positions from the river. These ships required large crews up to 100 sailors and marines. Smaller vessels carried 20 to 30 men and were used for rapid response and raiding. Wu's marines were specialized infantry trained for amphibious operations. They wore lighter armor than Wei's heavy infantry. Mobility was more important than protection. They carried short swords, spears, and crossbows. Wu's naval tactics emphasized speed and surprise. Fleets would launch night raids on Wei-held riverbanks, destroy supplies, and withdraw before Wei forces could respond. The Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 CE remains the most famous naval engagement of the era. Cao Cao's forces, numbering over 200,000, advanced down the Yangtze to crush the Wushu alliance. Wu's admiral, Zhou Yu, exploited Cao Cao's lack of naval experience. Cao's fleet anchored in close formation, standard practice for land armies but disastrous for ships. Wu launched fire ships vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze into Cao's fleet. The resulting fire destroyed much of Cao's navy and forced his retreat. Red Cliffs established Wu's naval superiority for decades. Wei learned from the defeat. Subsequent Wei naval forces were better trained and better equipped, yet Wei never achieved parity with Wu on the water. The Yangtze remained Wu's domain. Wu's land forces were competent but not exceptional. Wu faced fewer land invasions than Shu Han, as the Yangtze provided a natural barrier. Wu's infantry was organized similarly to Wei's heavy and light divisions, crossbows, and pikes. Wu's cavalry was smaller and less effective than Wei's, as the southern terrain was less suitable for horse breeding. Wu's strategic challenge was political stability. The Sun family maintained control through a combination of military success and political maneuvering. Yet Wu's aristocracy was fractious. Regional commanders often acted semi-independently. This decentralization provided flexibility but also created coordination challenges. Wu's ability to project power was limited by internal cohesion. The Three Kingdoms period saw significant military innovations. The repeating crossbow was the most famous. Traditional crossbows required manual cocking after each shot. The repeating crossbow used a lever mechanism to automatically load bolts from a magazine. This increased the rate of fire from 1 bolt per minute to 10 bolts per minute. In defensive positions, this weapon was devastating. Armor technology advanced incrementally. Lamellar armor overlapping iron plates provided better protection than earlier leather or bronze armor, yet it was heavier and more expensive. Only elite units were fully equipped with iron lamellar. Most infantry wore leather armor reinforced with metal plates at critical points: chest, shoulders, and helmet. Siege technology remained crucial. Trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls, demoralizing defenders and destroying structures. Siege towers allowed attackers to scale walls without ladders. Battering rams, protected by mobile shelters, breached gates, yet sieges were time-consuming. A well-provisioned city could hold out for months. Attackers faced the risk of disease and supply exhaustion. The crossbow itself underwent refinements. Trigger mechanisms became more reliable. Bow staves were made from composite materials, wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, increasing draw weight and range. Crossbow bolts were mass-produced with standardized sizes for logistical efficiency. Naval technology advanced in Wu territory. Wu shipyards developed techniques for constructing larger vessels with improved stability. Hull designs incorporated watertight compartments, preventing ships from sinking if damaged. Wu's engineers also developed paddle wheel propulsion, manually operated wheels on the sides of ships, increasing speed and maneuverability. Yet the most important technological factor was metallurgy. Steel production required high-temperature furnaces and skilled blacksmiths. The quality of steel determined the effectiveness of weapons and armor. Shu Han's isolated position forced it to develop advanced metallurgical techniques. Its weapons were renowned for quality, though produced in smaller quantities than Wei's mass-produced equivalents. The Three Kingdoms War was not won by technological superiority. All three kingdoms had access to similar weapons. The difference was in application. Wei's advantage was scale: more soldiers, more weapons, more supplies. Shu Han's advantage was strategic defense and disciplined application of force. Wu's advantage was naval supremacy and economic resilience. Zhuge Liang assumed control of Shu Han's military strategy in 227 CE. His predecessor, Liu Bei, had died after a disastrous campaign against Wu. Shu Han was weakened and diplomatically isolated. Zhuge Liang understood that passive defense was strategic suicide. Wei controlled the demographic and economic advantages. Given time, Wei would eventually overwhelm Shu Han through sheer attrition. Zhuge's solution was preemptive offense. Between 228 and 234 CE, he launched 5 northern campaigns into Wei territory. None achieved their ultimate objective, the conquest of the Wei heartland, but none were intended to. Zhuge's strategy was to apply continuous pressure on Wei's frontier, forcing Wei to maintain large garrisons and divert resources from other theaters. The first northern campaign in 228 CE began with deception. Zhuge dispatched a small force under Zhao Yun to threaten the Qishan Pass, drawing Wei attention westward. Meanwhile, Zhuge led the main Shu army northward through the Qinling Mountains, bypassing Wei's prepared defenses. The maneuver succeeded initially. Shu forces captured several Wei cities and accepted the surrender of local garrisons. Yet logistical friction intervened. Shu's supply lines stretched thin. Wei's commander, Cao Zun, reorganized Wei forces and counterattacked. Shu's forward general, Ma Su, disobeyed orders and deployed his forces on high ground rather than near a critical water source. Wei forces surrounded Ma Su's position and cut off his water supply. Ma Su's forces, dehydrated and demoralized, collapsed. Zhuge Liang was forced to retreat. The failure of the first campaign illustrated Zhuge Liang's central challenge. Shu Han's limited manpower meant that every tactical defeat had strategic consequences. Wei could absorb losses and continue fighting. Shu could not. Zhuge executed Ma Su for disobedience, a brutal reminder that discipline was existential. The second northern campaign in 228 CE targeted Wei's western frontier. Zhuge advanced through the Chenkang Pass. Wei had fortified the pass after the first campaign. Shu forces besieged the fortification but failed to breach it. Wei reinforcements arrived. Zhuge retreated again. The third campaign in 229 CE captured the cities of Wudu and Yinping. These were minor strategic gains, but they extended Shu's defensive perimeter and provided forward supply depots for future campaigns. Wei's response was muted. Internal political struggles within Wei distracted from frontier defense. The fourth campaign in 231 CE saw Zhuge Liang advance to the Qishan region once more. Wei's commander, Sima Yi, adopted a defensive strategy. Rather than engage Shu forces directly, Sima Yi fortified his positions and waited. He understood Zhuge Liang's logistical constraints. Shu forces could not remain in Wei territory indefinitely. Sima Yi's strategy was to outlast the invasion. Zhuge Liang attempted to force an engagement. He deployed troops to threaten Sima Yi's supply lines. Sima Yi refused to be baited. The campaign stalled. Shu forces consumed their supplies. After several months, Zhuge Liang withdrew. The fifth and final campaign in 234 CE was Zhuge Liang's most ambitious. He advanced to the Wujiang Plains deep into Wei territory. Shu forces constructed fortifications and prepared for a prolonged campaign. Zhuge implemented a system of rotating agricultural work soldiers would farm Wei land to sustain themselves. This was an attempt to solve the logistical problem that had plagued previous campaigns. Sima Yi again refused battle. He constructed defensive positions opposite Shu's fortifications and waited. Zhuge Liang sent messengers to Sima Yi, taunting him for cowardice. Sima Yi ignored the provocations. He understood that time was Shu Han's enemy. In August 234 CE, Zhuge Liang died of illness in his camp. His death was kept secret initially to prevent panic. Shu forces conducted an orderly withdrawal. Sima Yi, learning of Zhuge's death, pursued cautiously. Shu forces left behind wooden statues of Zhuge Liang in their camp. When Wei scouts reported the statues, Sima Yi halted the pursuit, fearing a trap. The phrase, "a dead Zhuge drives off a living Sima," entered Chinese military literature. Zhuge Liang's campaigns did not conquer Wei, yet they achieved strategic results. Wei was forced to maintain permanent garrisons along the Shu frontier. Resources that could have been used against Wu were diverted northward. Wei's internal politics were destabilized by military stalemate. Zhuge Liang's strategy was not conquest. It was strategic exhaustion. While Zhuge Liang campaigned in the north, Wu and Wei fought a series of brutal engagements along the Yangtze. The strategic objective was control of crossing points. Wei sought to invade Wu's heartland. Wu sought to prevent Wei from achieving a lodgment on the southern bank. The city of Hefei became the focal point. Located on the northern bank of the Yangtze, Hefei was Wei's forward base for southern operations. Wu launched multiple attempts to capture the city. Wei reinforced its defenses after each attack. The result was a decades-long siege cycle. In 222 CE, Wu's forces, numbering over 100,000, besieged Hefei. Wei's garrison, commanded by Zhang Liao, numbered only 7,000. Zhang Liao recognized that passive defense was futile. He launched a surprise sortie with 800 picket men, attacking Wu's main camp at dawn. The attack created chaos in Wu's lines. Zhang Liao's forces killed several Wu commanders before withdrawing. Wu's siege failed. The psychological impact of Zhang Liao's sortie demoralized Wu's troops. Wei reinforcements arrived, forcing Wu to lift the siege. Zhang Liao's defense of Hefei became legendary in Chinese. Military history, a demonstration that tactical audacity could offset numerical disadvantage. Yet Wu's strategy was not solely military. Wu's economy was stronger than Wei's in the south. Wu could afford to sustain prolonged campaigns. Wu's admirals launched amphibious raids on Wei-held territories along the Yangtze, disrupting Wei's logistics and forcing Wei to disperse its forces. In 234 CE, concurrent with Zhuge Liang's Fifth Northern Campaign, Wu launched a coordinated offensive against Wei. Wu's forces advanced on multiple axes, attempting to overwhelm Wei's defenses. Wei's generals, including Sima Yi's sons, coordinated a defense-in-depth strategy. Wei forces traded space for time, falling back to fortified positions and allowing Wu's offensive to exhaust itself. The campaign ended inconclusively. Wu captured some territory but failed to achieve a breakthrough. Wei's defenses held. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Yangtze frontier returned to its default state, a grinding stalemate punctuated by raids and skirmishes. The alliance between Wu and Shu Han was always fragile. Both kingdoms needed each other to balance against Wei, yet both also harbored ambitions of reunification under their own rule. The mountainous terrain separating Wu and Shu Han made large-scale conflict impractical, but border skirmishes were frequent. In 222 CE, Liu Bei launched a major campaign against Wu. The pretext was revenge for the death of Guan Yu, a Shu general killed by Wu forces in 219 CE. The real motive was territorial expansion. Liu Bei advanced with a large army into Wu territory. Wu's general, Lu Xun, adopted a defensive strategy. He avoided pitched battles and allowed Liu Bei's forces to advance deep into Wu territory. Shu's supply lines stretched thin. Lu Xun waited for the optimal moment, then launched a coordinated counterattack. Wu forces used fire attacks to destroy Shu's camps. Liu Bei's army collapsed. He retreated to Beidasheng, where he died shortly afterward. The defeat was catastrophic for Shu Han. Liu Bei's death created a succession crisis. Zhuge Liang assumed regency for Liu Bei's young son. Shu Han's military capacity was severely weakened. Zhuge Liang's subsequent northern campaigns were, in part, attempts to restore Shu Han's strategic position after this disaster. Wu and Shu Han resumed their alliance afterward, recognizing that mutual survival required cooperation against Wei, yet the alliance was never fully trusted by either side. Wu maintained fortifications along the Shu border. Shu Han maintained garrisons facing Wu. Both kingdoms understood that the alliance was temporary, strategic convenience rather than a political union. Zhuge Liang's death in 234 CE marked the beginning of Shu Han's strategic decline. His successor, Jiang Wei, inherited an impossible situation. Shu Han's population had not recovered from the wars of the 220s, military casualties. Agricultural disruption and disease had created a demographic crisis. Shu Han's army numbered approximately 80,000 less than half of what Zhuge Liang had commanded. Jiang Wei understood that he could not replicate Zhuge Liang's campaigns. Shu Han lacked the resources. Yet Jiang also understood that passive defense would allow Wei to rebuild and eventually overwhelm Shu. Jiang adopted a modified version of Zhuge's strategy: smaller, more frequent raids into Wei territory. These raids were not intended to conquer land. They were intended to disrupt Wei's agricultural production and prevent Wei from accumulating reserves for a major offensive. Between 238 and 262 CE, 11 northern campaigns. Most were small-scale operations involving 10 to 20,000 troops. They achieved limited tactical success. Wei's defenses, strengthened after decades of conflict, were difficult to penetrate. Jiang Wei captured minor frontier outposts but failed to achieve strategic gains. Jiang Wei's campaigns drained Shu Han's remaining resources. Each campaign required the mobilization of supplies and manpower. Agricultural production in Sichuan declined as farmers were conscripted. Shu Han's economy, already strained, began to collapse under the weight of continuous military operations. Political opposition to Jiang Wei's strategy grew within Shu Han. Court factions argued for peace negotiations with Wei. Jiang Wei resisted, believing that any peace would be a prelude to Wei invasion. The internal political struggle weakened Shu Han's cohesion. By 260 CE, Shu Han's military effectiveness had declined sharply. Soldiers were poorly equipped. Training standards had dropped. Morale was low. Wei's intelligence network reported Shu Han's weakness. Wei's rulers, now controlled by the Sima family, began planning a final campaign to conquer Shu Han. Wei's political landscape transformed during the 240s and 250s. The Cao family, which had founded the Wei state, gradually lost control to the Sima family. Sima Yi, the general who had countered Zhuge Liang's northern campaigns, became the most powerful figure in Wei. In 249 CE, Sima Yi staged a coup against the Cao family regent. He seized control of the Wei capital and executed his political rivals. Sima Yi's sons, Sima Shi and Sima Zhao, inherited their father's position. By 260 CE, the Sima family controlled Wei's military and civilian administration. The Cao emperor was a figurehead. The Sima family's consolidation of power had strategic implications. The internal political struggles that had distracted Wei from frontier campaigns were resolved. The Sima family could now commit Wei's full resources to external conquest. Shu Han and Wu were the targets. Sima Zhao, who controlled Wei by the 260s, recognized that Shu Han was the weaker target. Shu's population was smaller, its military was exhausted, and its political cohesion was fractured. Sima Zhao planned a three-pronged invasion of Shu Han, designed to overwhelm Shu's defenses through simultaneous pressure on multiple axes. The invasion was scheduled for 263 CE. Wei's generals were Zhang Hui. Deng Ai and Zhuge Su. Zhang Hui commanded the main force, advancing through the traditional northern route. Deng Ai commanded a secondary force, advancing through the mountainous western route. Zhuge Liang commanded a diversionary force threatening Shu's eastern frontier. Wei's invasion force numbered over 150,000, nearly double Shu Han's entire military. Shu Han's generals recognized the existential threat. Jiang Wei mobilized Shu's remaining forces and prepared to defend the mountain passes. Zhang Hua's main force advanced through the Kindling Mountains. Jiang Wei positioned Shu's largest army at the Jianghe Pass, the traditional choke point for northern invasions. Jianghe was heavily fortified with multiple layers of wooden palisades and crossbow towers. Jiang Wei's strategy was to hold Jianghe while using smaller forces to harass the other Wei columns. Zhang Hua's forces besieged Jianghe but could not break through. Shu's defenders inflicted heavy casualties on Wei's attacking forces. For several weeks, the campaign seemed to stall. Wei's other columns also faced difficult terrain and determined resistance. Yet Deng Ai's western column achieved a breakthrough. Deng Ai led his forces through the mountains along a route considered impassable. His troops dismantled portions of the mountain trail and lowered supplies down cliffs using ropes. The march was brutal. Many soldiers died from falls or exposure. Yet Deng Ai's force emerged behind Shu's main defensive line. Deng Ai's sudden appearance in Shu's interior caused panic. Jiang Wei, holding Jianghe, was cut off from the capital. Shu Han's emperor Liu Shan faced an immediate crisis. Deng Ai's forces advanced rapidly toward Chengdu. Liu Shan's advisors debated whether to evacuate or surrender. Deng Ai sent a message to Liu Shan, offering lenient terms if Shu Han surrendered immediately. Resistance, Deng Ai warned, would result in the destruction of Chengdu and the execution of the Shu royal family. Liu Shan, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, chose surrender. In late 263 CE, Liu Shan formally abdicated. Shu Han ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Jiang Wei, still holding Jianghe, received orders to surrender. He complied, though he reportedly wept at the news. Wei forces occupied Chengdu without significant resistance. The fall of Shu Han was a logistical and strategic masterpiece. Deng Ai's flanking maneuver, later recognized as one of the great tactical achievements of the Three Kingdoms period, bypassed Shu's strongest defenses. Yet it was also a gamble. Had Deng Ai's column been detected and intercepted, it would have been destroyed. The success depended on speed, surprise, and Shu Han's inability to redeploy forces quickly. Shu Han's population was integrated into Wei. Shu's military was disbanded. Shu's aristocracy was relocated to Wei's heartland to prevent rebellions. The Sichuan Basin, Shu Han's core territory, became a Wei province. Shu Han's collapse left Wu isolated. Wei now controlled 2/3 of China's territory and population. Wu's survival depended on its ability to defend the Yangtze River frontier indefinitely. Wu's rulers understood that Wei would eventually invade. Wu's strategy was defense in depth. The Yangtze River was the first defensive line. Wu's navy patrolled constantly, interdicting any Wei attempt to establish bridgeheads on the southern bank. The second defensive line was a network of fortified cities along the river. These cities were provisioned to withstand prolonged sieges. Wu also invested in internal development. Rice production in Wu's southern territories was expanded. New agricultural lands were cleared. Wu's population, though smaller than Wei's, was stable. Wu's economy remained functional. Yet Wu faced internal challenges. The Sun family's control was weakening. Regional commanders often acted independently. Court politics were fractious. Wu's military leadership was divided between those advocating offensive operations against Wei and those advocating pure defense. In 264 CE, Wei formally became the Jin dynasty. Sima Yan, grandson of Sima Yi, usurped the Wei throne and declared himself emperor of Jin. The transition was seamless. Jin inherited Wei's military, bureaucracy, and strategic position. Jin's objective was clear conquest of Wu and reunification of China. Wu's diplomacy was limited. No external power could provide meaningful assistance. Wu sent embassies to Central Asian states seeking alliances. None materialized. Wu was strategically alone. Between 264 and 279 CE, Jin prepared for the final campaign. Jin's generals studied Wu's defenses. They constructed a fleet of warships, trained amphibious forces, and accumulated supplies. Jin's strategy was overwhelming, force multiple simultaneous invasions along the Yangtze, preventing Wu from concentrating its defenses. By 279 CE, Jin's preparations were complete. Emperor Sima Yan authorized the invasion. Jin's commander-in-chief was Du Yu, a veteran general who had served in the campaigns against Shu Han. Yu's strategy was to attack Wu on multiple fronts simultaneously, overwhelming Wu's capacity to respond. Jin's invasion force numbered over 200,000. It was divided into 6 armies, each assigned a specific axis of advance. The northern armies would cross the Yangtze and drive toward Wu's capital, Jiani. The western armies would advance through the mountains, threatening Wu's interior. The eastern armies would conduct amphibious landings along Wu's coast. Wu's defenses were formidable. The Yangtze River was wide and difficult to cross under fire. Wu's navy could intercept Jin's troop transports. Wu's fortified cities were stocked with supplies for extended sieges. Yet Wu's strategic position was fundamentally compromised. Jin could afford losses, Wu could not. The invasion began in early 279 CE. Jin's northern army, commanded by Wang Jun, constructed a fleet of large warships. These vessels were equipped with armored hulls and trebuchets. Jin's engineers developed rush ships, fast, maneuverable vessels designed to ram Wu's warships. Wu's navy attempted to contest the crossings. Yet Jin's numerical superiority was decisive. Jin's warships absorbed losses and continued advancing. Wu's fleet was forced to withdraw downriver. Jin established bridgeheads on the Yangtze's southern bank. Wu's land forces attempted counterattacks against Jin's bridgeheads. These attacks were repelled. Jin's infantry, supported by crossbowmen and cavalry, held their positions. Jin's engineers constructed pontoon bridges, allowing additional forces to cross the river. By mid-279 CE, Jin forces were advancing on multiple axes. Wu's regional commanders faced impossible choices. Concentrating forces to defend the capital left other regions exposed. Defending everywhere meant defending nowhere effectively. Wu's defensive strategy unraveled quickly. Jin's western armies advanced through the mountains, threatening Wu's supply lines to the interior. Wu's forces, attempting to defend both the Yangtze frontier and the interior, were stretched too thin. In late 279 CE, Jin's forces captured the city of Jiangling, a major Wu supply depot. The loss of Jiangling severed Wu's supply lines to the western frontier. Wu forces in the west were cut off and forced to surrender or retreat. Wu's capital, Jian, was now directly threatened. Jin's northern armies advanced down the Yangtze toward the city. Wu's emperor, Sun Hao, ordered the mobilization of all remaining reserves. Wu's generals advised evacuation to the south. Sun Hao refused, fearing that evacuation would trigger mass defections. Jin's forces besieged Jian in early 280 CE. The city's walls were strong, but Jin's trebuchets pounded them relentlessly. Jin's engineers constructed siege towers and prepared for an assault. Wu's defenders fought desperately, but supplies were dwindling. Wu's regional armies attempted to relieve the capital. These attempts were intercepted and defeated by Jin's mobile forces. Wu's navy, weakened by months of attrition, could not break through Jin's river blockade. In March 280 CE, Sun Hao surrendered. The terms were similar to those offered to Shu Han: abdication, integration into Jin, and relocation of the royal family. Wu's generals were offered positions in the Jin military if they swore loyalty. Most accepted. Wu ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Jin forces occupied Jian without significant resistance. The Three Kingdoms period ended. China was reunified under the Jin Dynasty. The reunification of China in 280 CE concluded 60 years of fragmentation. The demographic cost was catastrophic. China's population in 184 CE, at the beginning of the Yellow Turban Rebellion that precipitated the Han collapse, was approximately 56 million. By 280 CE, after the Three Kingdoms period, the recorded population was approximately 16 million. Not all of this decline represents actual deaths. Census data from the period was incomplete. Many people lived outside government registration systems, either as refugees or under the control of local warlords. Historians estimate the true population in 280 CE was closer to 25 to 30 million. Yet even this revised estimate represents a population decline of approximately 50%. The causes of this decline were multiple. Direct combat casualties were significant but not the primary factor. Armies numbered in the tens of thousands, not millions. The largest battles involved 50 to 100,000 combatants. Total combat deaths across 60 years likely numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The primary killers were famine and disease. The collapse of the Han Dynasty's administrative infrastructure meant the collapse of public irrigation systems. Dikes fell into disrepair, canals silted up, farmland productivity declined. Warlords requisitioned grain, leaving peasant communities with insufficient reserves. Multi-year famines were common. Disease followed famine. Malnourished populations were vulnerable to epidemics. Smallpox, typhus, and plague spread through refugee columns and besieged cities. Sanitation systems in urban areas collapsed. Water supplies became contaminated. Disease mortality was likely higher than combat mortality. The economic destruction was equally severe. China's sophisticated monetary economy largely collapsed. The Han Dynasty's copper coinage system fragmented. Local warlords minted their own coins, leading to inflation and currency confusion. Barter economies re-emerged in many regions. Trade networks contracted. The Silk Road continued to function, but trade volumes declined. Internal trade within China, the movement of goods between regions, was disrupted by war and banditry. Regional economies became more self-sufficient by necessity, not choice. Urbanization reversed. Many cities shrank or were abandoned. Luoyang, the Wei capital, was destroyed in 190 CE during the initial warlord conflicts. It was partially rebuilt but never regained its former size. Jian, Wu's capital, survived intact but lost population after Jin's conquest. Yet the Three Kingdoms period also produced innovations. Military technology advanced. Administrative systems adapted to wartime conditions. The Tuntian military agriculture system developed by Cao Cao provided a model for later dynasties. The concept of meritocratic military promotion judging officers by performance, rather than aristocratic birth, became more widespread. Literary and artistic production flourished despite the chaos. The Three Kingdoms period produced significant historical records, poetry, and philosophical texts. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a later novelization of the period, became one of China's foundational literary works. The Three Kingdoms War demonstrated the limits of attrition as a strategic doctrine. All three kingdoms adopted strategies designed to exhaust their rivals. Wei sought to outlast Shu Han and Wu through demographic superiority. Shu Han sought to bleed Wei through continuous frontier campaigns. Wu sought to defend the Yangtze indefinitely, waiting for Wei to exhaust itself. Yet attrition strategies failed to produce decisive results for decades. The reason was geography. China's vast distances and difficult terrain created natural defensive advantages. Mountain passes in Sichuan could be held by small forces against large armies. The Yangtze River functioned as a moat. Warlords could retreat to fortified cities and withstand sieges for months. The eventual Jin victory resulted not from superior attrition but from strategic concentration. Jin focused its resources on conquering Shu Han first. Once Shu Han fell, Jin possessed overwhelming superiority against Wu. The lesson was that sequential conquest defeating enemies one at a time was more effective than simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. Zhuge Liang's northern campaigns illustrated the challenge of offensive operations under resource constraints. Shu Han could not sustain large armies in Wei territory. Logistics, the movement of grain, the maintenance of supply lines imposed hard limits on operational reach. Zhuge's genius was recognizing that even unsuccessful campaigns had strategic value if they diverted Wei resources and prevented Wei from concentrating against Shu. The importance of logistics cannot be overstated. The Three Kingdoms War was won by the kingdom that could sustain its armies in the field longest. Wei's Tuntian system provided localized grain reserves, reducing dependence on long supply convoys. Wu's control of the Yangtze allowed for riverine transport, which was far more efficient than overland transport. Shu Han's mountainous terrain created logistical nightmares for invaders but also constrained Shu's ability to project power. The role of leadership was significant but not determinative. Zhuge Liang was a brilliant strategist, yet his campaigns did not conquer Wei. Cao Cao unified northern China through a combination of military skill and political ruthlessness, yet he could not conquer the south. Sun Quan maintained Wu's independence for decades through naval superiority and defensive discipline, yet Wu eventually fell to Jin's overwhelming force. The Three Kingdoms period demonstrated that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. Shu Han's small population meant it could never defeat Wei in a war of attrition. Wu's geographic isolation meant it could not project power into northern China. Wei's two-front exposure meant it faced continuous military strain even as it possessed the largest armies. The Three Kingdoms period accelerated military innovation. The repeating crossbow became widespread, though it never fully replaced the single-shot crossbow. The repeating crossbow's advantages, higher rate of fire, ease of use were offset by its shorter range and mechanical complexity. Cavalry tactics evolved significantly. The integration of stirrups allowed for more effective mounted combat. Cavalry archers could fire while mounted with greater accuracy. Cavalry shock charges using lances and the momentum of the horse became more devastating. Wei's northern plains provided ideal terrain for cavalry operations. Shu Han and Wu adapted by developing anti-cavalry tactics, crossbow formations, polearm infantry, and field fortifications. Siege warfare became more sophisticated. Trebuchets reached larger sizes and greater accuracy. Siege engineers developed counterweight systems that reduced the manpower required to operate the weapons. Defensive fortifications evolved in response: thicker walls, sloped earthworks to deflect projectiles, and layered defenses to absorb attacks. Naval warfare in China reached new levels of complexity. Wu's shipyards produced specialized vessels, fire ships for attacks, heavily armored ships for defense, fast patrol boats for reconnaissance. Naval tactics emphasized maneuver and fire attacks. The Battle of Red Cliffs demonstrated that naval superiority could offset numerical disadvantage on land. The integration of combined arms infantry, cavalry, and ranged units became standard doctrine. Armies that relied on a single unit type were vulnerable to combined arms attacks. Wei's cavalry could break infantry formations, but cavalry was vulnerable to concentrated crossbow fire. Crossbowmen could devastate charging cavalry, but crossbowmen were vulnerable to flanking attacks. Successful commanders coordinated all three unit types. The Three Kingdoms period also saw the development of specialized military literature. Treatises on tactics, strategy, and logistics were written by commanders and scholars. These texts influenced later Chinese military thought. The concept of strategic deception, misleading the enemy about one's intentions, became formalized. Zhuge Liang's use of feints and ambush became case studies for future generations. Yet the fundamental constraints of pre-industrial warfare remained unchanged. Armies moved at walking speed. Supplies were transported by ox cart or riverboat. Communication was limited to messengers on horseback. These constraints meant that strategic tempo was slow. Campaigns lasted months or years. The decisive battle, so prized by later military theorists, was rare. Most campaigns ended through attrition, supply exhaustion, or political changes. The casualty figures from the Three Kingdoms period are estimates, not precise counts. Historical records provide totals for some battles, but not comprehensive data. The estimated 36 to 40 million population decline includes combat deaths, famine deaths, disease deaths, and demographic disruption. Combat deaths likely numbered between 500,000 and 1 million. The largest battles: Red Cliffs, the campaigns for Hefei, Zhuge Liang's northern campaigns, the Jin conquest of Shu Han and Wu, each resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. Smaller skirmishes and sieges, occurring continuously for 60 years, accumulated additional losses. Famine deaths likely numbered in the millions. The collapse of irrigation systems and the requisitioning of grain by armies created chronic food insecurity. Multi-year famines occurred in multiple regions. The Yellow River Basin, once the most productive agricultural region in China, experienced severe depopulation. Disease deaths are difficult to estimate. Epidemic outbreaks are mentioned in historical records, but without precise casualty figures. The combination of malnutrition, Population displacement and poor sanitation created conditions for epidemic spread. The social consequences extended beyond mortality. Refugee populations moved constantly, seeking safety and food. Social structures collapsed in many regions. The Confucian ideal of stable, hierarchical communities was replaced by militarized, survival-oriented societies. The aristocracy adapted. Landowners who survived the chaos often did so by becoming military leaders. The distinction between civilian and military authority blurred. The Jin dynasty inherited a society where military power was the primary determinant of political authority. Women's roles in society were affected. With large numbers of men killed in combat, women took on economic roles traditionally held by men. Widows managed estates. Women worked in fields. The social rigidity of the early Han period loosened out of necessity. The psychological impact is impossible to quantify. 3 generations grew up in a society where war was the default condition. The concept of peace became abstract. The Confucian ideal of benevolent governance seemed irrelevant when survival required ruthlessness. The Three Kingdoms period established patterns that recurred throughout Chinese history. The cycle of dynastic collapse, fragmentation, and reunification became a recognizable pattern. Future dynasties studied the Three Kingdoms period to avoid similar collapses. The importance of centralized administration was reinforced. The Han Dynasty's collapse was precipitated by the weakening of central authority and the rise of regional warlords. Later dynasties implemented administrative reforms designed to prevent provincial commanders from accumulating excessive power. The strategic value of the Yangtze River was confirmed. Wu's ability to defend the Yangtze for decades demonstrated that river control was decisive. Later dynasties invested heavily in naval forces to ensure control of China's major rivers. The demographic consequences of prolonged war influenced later strategic thought. Chinese military theorists emphasized the importance of minimizing civilian casualties and preserving agricultural capacity. The ideal war in later Chinese thought was one that achieved political objectives with minimal destruction. The Three Kingdoms period became a foundational narrative in East Asian culture. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 14th-century novel based on the historical events, became required reading for military officers and political leaders. The novel's emphasis on strategic cunning, loyalty, and the tragic inevitability of conflict shaped cultural attitudes toward war. Japanese military leaders studied the Three Kingdoms period. The tactics of Zhuge Liang and Cao Cao were analyzed by samurai commanders. Korean military academies included Three Kingdoms case studies in their curriculum. Vietnamese generals drew lessons from the campaigns of Wu and Shu Han. The Three Kingdoms period also influenced Chinese perceptions of unity and fragmentation. The ideal of a unified China, governed by a single legitimate dynasty, was reinforced by the chaos of the Three Kingdoms era. Fragmentation came to be associated with suffering. Unity came to be associated with prosperity. This cultural narrative influenced Chinese politics for centuries. The question of inevitability haunts the Three Kingdoms period. Was reunification under Jin predetermined, or could the stalemate have continued indefinitely? Historical counterfactuals are speculative, but the structural factors suggest that reunification was likely, though not guaranteed. Wei's demographic and territorial advantages created a baseline probability favoring Wei's eventual dominance. A kingdom controlling 2/3 of China's territory and population had inherent advantages. Yet Wei's two-front exposure created vulnerabilities. Had Shu Han and Wu coordinated their military operations more effectively, Wei could have been bled to the point of collapse. Shu Han's survival depended on its ability to maintain defensive cohesion and avoid strategic overreach. Zhuge Liang's campaigns were sustainable only because they were limited in scope. Jiang Wei's later campaigns, more ambitious but less carefully managed, accelerated Shu Han's decline. Had Shu Han adopted a purely defensive posture, it might have survived longer. Yet passive defense would have allowed Wei to choose the time and place of engagement. Wu's survival depended on its naval superiority and the Yangtze River barrier. Yet Wu's inability to project power northward meant it could not weaken Wei directly. Wu's strategy was essentially passive defend the river and wait for Wei to collapse internally. This strategy succeeded for decades but ultimately failed when Jin consolidated Wei's resources and prepared a focused invasion. Had the Three Kingdoms period continued for another generation, the demographic and economic recovery might have changed the strategic balance. Regions depopulated by war would have been resettled, agricultural production would have recovered. Yet this recovery would have required peace, and the Three Kingdom system was inherently unstable. Each kingdom feared that allowing rivals to recover would create future threats. The Jin conquest of Wu in 280 CE ended the Three Kingdoms period but did not create lasting stability. The Jin dynasty itself collapsed into civil war within 30 years. Northern China fragmented again during the 16 Kingdoms period. True reunification did not occur until the Sui dynasty in 589 CE. Over 300 years after the fall of the Han, the Three Kingdoms period was not an aberration. It was a symptom of deeper structural problems in Chinese governance. The Han Dynasty's collapse revealed the fragility of centralized authority over vast territories with limited communication technology. The Three Kingdoms period was an attempt by regional powers to reconstruct authority through military force. That attempt succeeded in reunifying China, but failed to create a stable political system. The Three Kingdoms War was a conflict of continental scale and generational duration. It was fought with iron and wood, with rivers and mountains as fortifications, with grain and horses as the sinews of power. It killed tens of millions, directly and indirectly. It reshaped China's geography, economy, and culture. Yet it was also a war of human decisions. Zhuge Liang's choice to launch northern campaigns rather than defend passively. Cao Cao's choice to attack Wu at Red Cliffs despite his lack of naval experience. Deng Ai's choice to lead his army through impassable mountains to flank Shu Han's defenses. These decisions, made under conditions of incomplete information and existential pressure, determined the course of history. The Three Kingdoms period remains a subject of study because it was war in its purest form, a contest of strategy, logistics, and endurance. It was a war without ideology, without external intervention, without decisive technological superiority. It was a war where the fundamental questions of military science, how to move armies, how to supply them, how to coordinate operations across vast distances determined outcomes. The lessons of the Three Kingdoms War remain relevant. The importance of logistics over tactics, the strategic value of defensive geography, the danger of overextension, the necessity of political cohesion, the inevitability of attrition in prolonged conflicts. These lessons have been relearned, often painfully, in wars throughout history. The Three Kingdoms period ended with reunification, but reunification came at a cost that few dynasties could afford to repeat. The war consumed China's demographic and economic reserves. It took centuries for China to recover fully. The price of unity was measured in millions of lives and decades of suffering. This was the Great Chinese Schism, a conflict that transformed a civilization and left scars that endured for generations. It was war as history, history as tragedy, and tragedy as a teacher for those willing to learn. The canvas of conflict is never truly finished. Each war leaves its mark on the historical landscape, each campaign its lesson in the art of strategy. At War Atelier, we continue to dissect the great military epics that shaped civilizations, examining the doctrine, the logistics, the human cost, and the strategic legacies that echo through time. If you found this analysis of the Three Kingdoms War compelling, if you appreciate history told with precision and depth rather than spectacle, then War Atelier is your forum. Subscribe to join a community that values intellectual rigor over sensationalism. Hit the notification bell to be alerted when we release our next deep analysis, from the Mongol conquest to the world wars, from ancient siegecraft to modern combined arms doctrine. Share this video with those who understand that war is not entertainment, but a subject worthy of serious study. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What strategic decisions from the Three Kingdoms period do you think were most consequential? What lessons apply to conflicts today? War Atelier, where history is analyzed, not dramatized, where the battlefield becomes a canvas for understanding power, strategy, and the human condition. Thank you for watching. Until the next campaign,